You've got the symbol of the ICC at the top there, and I will from now on just refer to it as the ICC. When you write about it, you can just call it the ICC. You don't have to spell out the 3 words in whole. Just call it the ICC. Not to be confused with the International Cricket Council. If you try and look it up, you'll keep finding the International Cricket Council, which has more power and authority than these guys, because it's got so much money. A couple of images that try to capture different ideas. Number one, the idea that the US has characterised by this vicious dog, doesn't respect human rights, and is based on the symbol for justice. Lady justice. And roads, obviously, judges of some sort, and going after what look like Africans, Sahara, his might. As with all global actors, your notes should come under these 4 headings: aims, roles, power, and influence. So if you're doing notes, they're your subheading. And again, only 4 possible questions for the ICC will involve one of these words. The aims. End impunity for the perpetrators of the most serious crimes. So in particular, Hitler and the Nazi regime, obviously guilty of horrendous genocide, and the world realised as they were setting up the UN that we needed some sort of body to try and prosecute the worst criminals. Germany was never going to prosecute Hitler. He was the leader of Germany. He's not going to prosecute himself. So we realised there was quite a flaw in this idea of justice when leaders are the ones committing the genocide, committing the serious crimes. And so for a period of about 30 or 40 years after World War II, we had these tribunals around the world, which were just independent, standalone tribunals. So they'd set themselves up for 5 years, they'd do their job, and they were gone. But the international community wanted a more permanent court, hence the ICC. So, trying the worst criminals and serving as a court of last resort. What this means is that if your courts don't have the capacity to try someone, here is this independent court over in The Hague in Europe, in Belgium. They can try this person for you. Holland, correct. Keep me on my toes. So it's this idea that not all states have the capacity to try their own leader. They might not be willing to try their own leader. The judges might be afraid of retribution from people within their own state. So here's an independent court, a court of last resort, somewhere else. They've got ongoing cases. There are actually very few cases relative to how many really bad crimes there are. And there are some big flaws, and we'll get to that when we talk about the limited effectiveness. It roles enforce the Rome Statutes. The Rome Statutes were the agreements that created the court. So here's an agreement which lays out 20 details about this court. The ICC enforces them. But more practically, it conducts trials and it prosecutes criminals. A statute is like a legal document or a legal agreement. So it's quite a simple role. Have cases, prosecute criminals. Really straightforward. And this is one of the most, one of the easiest global actors to remember because its name is what it does. It's a criminal court. A court hears cases and then it sends people to prison. So you can remember its role quite simply by its name. I don't know. I imagine they wouldn't be in their own respective countries because that's why they weren't trying them to begin with there. I'm not sure if The Hague has its own little prison facility where you just got just horror cases right next to each other lined up. You got Gaddafi going, hey Saddam, lunchtime. They exchange stories. Frightening stuff. Alright, the power of the court. It has power, but very limited jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is like your ability to exercise legal control. So you could say, I have some jurisdiction in this classroom. I would have zero jurisdiction in your homes. So jurisdiction is like the boundaries of your power or control. It only has it in several cases. One, the accused is a national of a state which is party to the treaty. Yeah, they don't have many, they've only got one guilty person ever. So they really don't need, 11 of those cells are empty. I'll go through it in a second, I'll get through it. Yeah. So, you can only be tried if your nation that you come from, your state, has signed the treaty. That's number one. So Australia has signed the Rome Statutes. Australians can be put before the ICC. America has not signed the ICC. Americans cannot be tried. That's number one. Number two, they're tried placed in the territory or state tied to the treaty. So even if Australia wasn't a signatory, if you committed an alleged war crime in France, France has signed the treaty, France could arrest you and send you to the ICC. In a way, those two things almost get cancelled out by the third one. The UN Security Council says so. If the UN Security Council says we have this horrible, horrible war criminal, he didn't do the crimes on territory which was a part of the treaty, he's not a member of a country which is part of this treaty, but he's done some terrible stuff, we authorise the ICC to put this guy before the court. Yeah. I mean, it's most of the people who end up there are former leaders of African countries. And they've used their power to either wipe out a minority. They're pretty senior in terms of international law, yes. They're very, very senior. But because they're former leaders, they're incredibly wealthy. So they all have access to really good lawyers. But these cases go for years and years and years, a decade in some cases. They're really complex. I imagine they have to stay near the court and they've got certain conditions around their movement.
So the American was up, but it was they haven't signed it.
They haven't signed it, so the Americans...
Got taken to the
Correct. That's why Americans, Russians, Chinese citizens would never end up in front of the ICC unless those countries agree.
We couldn't get anything.
I know China hasn't. I can't remember about Russia. There's a map in 2 seconds in the next slide. But in a way, those countries are never going to let their citizens go before the ICC. The other thing is that would Australia ever send an Australian, so let's say we've got a terrible criminal in Australia. Would we send them to the ICC? Why not? No, someone, yes, our courts function. They're independent. There's no one hunting down judges and punishing them for the cases they're hearing. We've got a really good functioning criminal system. Same with America, same with Russia. Well, I shouldn't say Russia. Take that back. So, it's limited. The power is limited, in particular, focusing on the whole UN Security Council states who haven't signed the Rome Statutes. It also has little power, up to 30 years.
It says that they have
Yeah, so there are cases that are currently open right now. So I imagine they're keeping the suspects there during the cases. But they've only ever found one person guilty. Bunga. And we've got a video on him in a moment. We're about to find out. Yes. The green are the countries who have signed and ratified. The orange are the countries who signed, but then went, nah, we're not that interested, so they never ratified. So for a treaty to come into effect, you need to sign it, your leader, and then usually your parliament or your government ratifies. think we've got a tendency to think of all of Africa as being the same, all really bad. Some African nations are incredibly stable, amazing democracies, strong economies, really open, loving people. So many of those African states are really nice, prosperous states with democracy and justice. Others are individual states who want to be part of the It has a tendency of going to war a lot, and it has a tendency of, during war, having lots of unintended victims, and that would open up a lot of their generals and military personnel for alleged war crimes.
What do you really gain by signing it as a leader?
If you sign it, it puts pressure on other states to sign it. So if we pulled out, then why would we? I mean, it's unlikely we're ever going to have an Australian war criminal. You know, it's not like someone can really put together a band of 10,000 soldiers and go hunt down a particular ethnic group here. We've got a pretty stable police system. But if all the other states in the world sign, perhaps in some of these more unstable regions, their leaders to be better. It's probably not the best idea, you're right, but they also usually have total control over their country, so I don't think it's ever going to come to that. The military is run by their brothers and their uncles. The whole national budget they use for whatever they want. They build 50 palaces. So those leaders never envisage that one day there'll be a downfall and they'll have to stand before a court. They've got the military. Power, hard power. As we just saw, there were 3 criteria. 1, your state could arrest you and send you to trial. You might be arrested on foreign territory, and that country sends you to the ICC, or the UN Security Council can say, there's, who was the child soldier guy? Coney. Yeah. So the UN Security Council said, well, this guy's, we think he's done some bad stuff, let's put out a warrant for his arrest. No. Correct. Coney, yes, we did. We all have. All right. Page 25 in your subject reader, a 1-page article. As with all of our global actors, we need to be able to talk about the influence of this global actor. And of course, we want to start by talking about how effective it has been in achieving its aim. Firstly, 122 member states. So we can say it is influential because the majority of states have signed up to the Rome Statute, giving the ICC authority. It's also been influential in establishing court infrastructure in situations in certain countries that need this kind of judicial support. It establishes a clear and functioning court. So the fact that the court has been established is a sign of its influence. And of course, a good example of its influence is the trial of Thomas Lubanga, who was sentenced for recruiting child war soldiers. We can also talk about the limitations to its effectiveness. As with all of our IGGs, they're dependent on states who have signed. So in this case, its influence is limited to those states who have signed the Rome Statute. The USA has not signed, China has not signed. So really important key global actors who have decided not to participate in the ICC. Its influence is also limited because the court does not have jurisdiction over states. This means it can't overrule states. It can issue arrest warrants and hope that states issue these arrest warrants and arrest particular individuals, but jurisdiction still lies with states. You could say that it hasn't been very influential because only African cases have been heard so far. And lastly, it doesn't have a police force. So its influence is limited because it relies on state cooperation in order to arrest and surrender suspects. This image captures some of the cases currently under investigation. You can see the overwhelming majority of them are in Central Africa.